This is an ABC podcast.
Hello, welcome to the Music Show on RN Summer. I'm Andrew Ford, and I hope you've come with your sea legs today.
In South Australia I was born, heave away, all the way. South Australia is my home, we're bound for South Australia. All the way you're rolling kings to me, heave away, all the way. All the way you'll hear me sing, we're bound for South Australia. Now as I walked out one morning fair, heave away, all the way. 'Twas there I met Miss Nancy Blair, we're bound for South Australia. All the way you're rolling kings to me, heave away, all the way. All the way you'll hear me sing, we're bound for South Australia. I shook her up, I shook her down, heave away, all the way. I shook her round and round the town, we're bound for South Australia. All the way you're rolling kings to me, heave away, all the way. All the way you'll hear me sing, we're bound for South Australia. There's just one thing that grieves my mind, heave away, all the way. That's leaving Nancy Blair behind, we're bound for South Australia. All the way you're rolling kings to me, heave away, all the way. All the way you'll hear me sing, we're bound for South Australia.
That's the English singer Johnny Collins with Dave Webber and Pete Watkinson, and one of the most famous shanties, South Australia. Shanties had their heyday in the 19th century, and they're our subject on today's music show. We'll talk to the Irish academic Jerry Smith, who's recently published a book called Sailor Song, The Shanties and Ballads of the High Seas. And we'll also have a conversation with Gary Greenwald. He is the man behind the Albany Shanty Men and also the Albany International Folk and Shanty Festival. A lot of these shanties were, of course, sung on whalers in the 19th century, and we start by talking about Wales, but in a very different context. We're going back 60,000 years or more. We're going to talk to Bunna Lawrie, who is a Mirning elder, a whale song man and custodian of his Mirning country. It stretches right along the Great Australian Bight. You might know him best as the frontman and the main songwriter in Coloured Stone. But we're going to start with some music from the soundtrack of a film from 2006 called Whale Dreamers. It was a film made by Julian Lennon and Kim Kindersley, and it shows how Bunna and the Mirning people have been fighting to protect their coast and the whales for a very long time.
Ra
That's whale dance chant, Jiddera, and it comes from the soundtrack of the film Whale Dreamers. And we heard Bunna Lawrie, Murray Burns and Grace Knight there, and I'm very pleased to welcome to the music show, I can't believe it's the first time, Bunna Lawrie. How are you doing, Bunna?
Good, mate, thank you.
Could you tell us, first of all, about your country, about Mirning country?
Well, Mirning country is, we call in our language, the Yinala Nation. Yinala Nation is a coastal group. The Mirning people are coastal people. And the Great Australian Bight is pretty much made up and held up at the moment by this, in the name, we call it the Yirrambay, the Rainbow Bridge in the Mirning name. The longest cliff line in the world, as you know, which the non-Indigenous people call it the Bunda Cliffs, means rock and boulders and stuff like that. But in our language, we call it Ngaga. The Ngaga Nguri is made in creation time by the great white whale, mythical ancestral whale called Jiddera. And he came from the Yidiri. When I say Yidiri, it's the Milky Way, it's a constellation from the cosmos. So in the dream time, and he came to Earth. So it's an amazing place, and it's a place which you call the Great Australian Bight.
And when you talk about your people's connection to the land, to the coast, to the cliffs, to the ocean, you're talking about approximately 3,000 generations. That's some connection, isn't it?
It's a long time. We can go back 65,000 years or more, Andy, where people have been, caretakers. And that's why today this beautiful ocean and beautiful land and seacoast country, it's all pristine and beautiful because our people have lived in harmony and live with connection of balance. And we have learned that from our ancestors. What was theirs is ours, and now their duties and responsibilities is ours. So we carry on that today, to carry on that balance of balancing. Only take what you need from the sea. It's a family to us, and it's a relationship that we continue to keep, for 5,000 years or more into the modern life of, the coming of when this place was also colonized, and we had to live with that, and we're still living that today. So it's a thing that but we never lose that connection to the country and the ocean about our responsibility and duties, how we care for country. So that's the most important thing to us. It's National NAIDOC Week this week, and the theme there is about healing. Mirning means listen, learn, understand, observe. And when you do that, you get wisdom and you get knowledge. If I cut that word in half, take that G-N-I off it, and you get Mirn. And Mirn also means, did you hear what I said in my language, I'm speaking English. And you say, Yalde. So, yes, I did. So if you cut those words in bits and pieces, you'll get all these different words and meanings. There's a word in there called Mirren. Just put an I in between the R and the N, you get Mirren. That means echo. We are the Mirning people. So it means, it's got 4 or 5 different meanings in that one word, Andrew.
Yes. But the meanings are all related to listening, aren't they? To hearing, at least.
That's right. Hearing and learning and understanding, and then observing. So it all fits in there. And that's Mirning. That's why we call them Mirning, because, we live on the cliff tops and we look out to the sea. So if we see anything strange, or we watch the whales, we observe the whales, we observe the fish, we observe every movement in the ocean, we observe everything in the land and on the beach, so that we know about the movements of Mother Earth's, creatures and creation. So it's incredible. And you were just talking about the whale song, well, the whale song, it's part of all that as well,
You're a whale song man. What does that mean, Bunna?
Well, my grandfather used to sing all these whale songs, and my 2 grandfathers, and, I've been blessed with it and passed down with the heritage of it to teach my children, the younger generation, and also teach other non-Indigenous people about how we connect to whales and how we live side by side as their family to us. We treat the whales as our family. It's an amazing relationship that we have with the whale. I can go on the beach and sit down and, just stare at the sea and start singing, and a whale will hear me and start coming over just to say hello. I was born to be a whale songman. You asked me what it means. A whale songman is about singing the songs and keeping that friendship and relationship with the whale and relationship with the sea.
You're listening to Radio National, to the music show. My guest is Bunna Lawrie, who is a Mirning elder, a Wales song man, and also, of course, as probably most of our listeners will know, the frontman of Coloured Stone. We should talk about Coloured Stone, Bunna, because you're talking about sharing songs. I mean, this was sharing songs on a very grand scale, wasn't it? And it's been going for, well, more than 40 years now, Coloured Stone. Is there a connection between what you did in Coloured Stone and what you've been talking about, that kind of sharing?
You know, I think music was my passion too, and I grew up, you know, some passion for music and my passion for my culture to teach other people, and it's one of the things that I passed down, my skills and knowledge about writing songs and how music comes to us. But we do have a great album coming out. Hopefully, we're trying to get it out by Christmas, and I'll keep it a secret, but when it does come out, it'll be awesome. So we're trying to mix it now, so it's going to be our 12th album, and I'm so grateful and thankful that you just can't stop the music, you know, not even COVID-19.
Do you think that music is what binds everything together in your life, all of the different aspects of your life? Is music the connecting factor?
You know, the world created music, you know, from the beginning of time. You know, the moment that the earth started spinning, it was music, Andrew. You know, you listen to the wind, all the elements, they make music when they blow through the roofs, they blow to the chimes, they blow from the sea to the land. You know, it's music. You know, people have learned by that from the sound, from the elements, from the wind, the rain, the lightning, the thunder. And we go back to the name Mirning, from the sound of the sea, from Mirren to the sound of all things. And we come from that. So, you know, music in my culture kept me alive. You know, I'm over the 70 mark, Andrew, and kept us alive. And, you know, most of my band members alive. And we inspired a lot of people, and we gave hope to a lot of people, especially with a song like Black Boy, you know, gave hope to not only Indigenous and Aboriginal men and women to this country, but non-Indigenous people really love the song as well. And that's surprisingly, because we owe it to Black Boy and songs like Dance in the Moonlight, No More Boomerang, and Kapi Polk, and all those songs, incredible Coloured Stone songs that you go to every community now, you'll hear every house, well, we playing this song, and Coloured Stone is everywhere in the houses. And we happen to be one of those bands who continue to contribute to the music and culture.
Bunna Lawrie, thank you very much for being on the music show. It's been an honour to have you as a guest.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you.
A shy black boy who came to the city to learn about life, and now his people lost their lives. His parents died when he was just a child, and now his life is mystified. Black boy, black boy, black boy, black boy. The color of your skin is your pride and joy.
We're listening to Black Boy from Coloured Stone. It's from their 1984 album, Coonibba Rock. Bunna Lawrie was speaking to me from South Australia. You're listening to the music show on RN Summer. A little later on the program, we'll head along to the other end of the Bight and talk to Gary Greenwald, who is the director of Albany International Folk and Shanty Festival. But before we do that, let's get the historical perspective on shanties. We'll chat to Jerry Smith.
As I was a-walking down Paradise Street,
To me way blow the man down.
a flash-looking pocket I chance for to me.
Oh, give me some time to blow the man down. Blow the man down, bullies, blow the man down. To me way blow the man down. Blowing right back to Liverpool town. Oh, give me some time to blow the man down.
She was bowling along with the wind blowing free.
To me way blow the man down.
She clewed up her courses and waited for me.
Oh, give me some time to blow the man down.
That was a whole chorus of men led by Harry H. Corbett, he of Steptoe and Son, singing one of the best-known sea shanties of all, Blow the Man Down. And some of the other singers in that chorus are Ian Campbell, Sam Larner, A.L. Lloyd, Ewan McCall, and Cyril Tawney. It's a pretty impressive chorus, that. Sea shanties is our subject on today's music show. Jerry Smith is the author of a book on the subject. It's called Sailor Song, The Shanties and Ballads of the High Seas, and it's a great pleasure to welcome him to the music show. Jerry, you're at Liverpool John Moores University, so that's, in a sense, the setting of that song, or at least where that song sets out from, isn't it? Quite a lot of songs, I assume, quite a lot of shanties have roots in Liverpool.
I think so. Yeah, its 19th century status as one of the kind of world's foremost ports rendered it kind of quite important in terms of the maritime imagination. So a lot of sailors coming out of there. Sailors are always talking about shipping out of Liverpool or returning to Liverpool, and the shanties were very adaptable anyway. So the same shanties could be kind of sung with reference to, streets in Sydney or in San Francisco or wherever. But certainly Liverpool looms large in the shanty imagination.
So what is a sea shanty? What are its hallmarks?
They were songs that were sung by working crews on board ships in order to kind of expedite the onboard tasks that needed to be undertaken in order to get the ship from A to B. These are mostly wind-driven vessels before steam really caught on and kind of rendered them obsolete towards the end of the 19th century. The wind vessels needed big sails, they needed to be pumped, the anchors needed to be raised, all those kind of things. That was all kind of back-breaking physical labour, and the sailors just found that it kind of went a little bit easier if it was accompanied by singing, which allowed them to kind of coordinate their efforts so that everybody was doing the same task at more or less the same time. The form itself is probably very old. People have probably always sung at sea. The ones that we're probably most familiar with are the ones which derive from the 19th century, and that's because they lasted into an age when they could be recorded, either actually recorded on playback technology or recorded by being transposed into musical form.
And so we're talking about a strong sense of rhythm, of course, but we're also talking about call and response, aren't we? And the response is where the sails get hauled or the capstan turned.
Yeah, that's right. It's a call and response form, which, it's familiar from other work scenarios as well. Most obviously, I guess, the plantation culture of the Deep South during the era of slavery in the United States. There's a shanty man who kind of sees the task to be done. This is usually quite a well-established, experienced member of the crew, and he would be kind of designated shanty man. And he would see whatever task needed to be done. He would understand the songs that would fit in with that task. So he would sing the first line.
All on the bowling, my bully ships are rolling.
And then all the crew would respond with the second line.
All on the bowling, ho.
And during that second line, there would be key moments during the rhythm, which everybody would know was coming up, and they would perform the same pulling or pushing task. And the third line would come along. It's again sung solo by the shanty man.
All on the bowling, the kitty is me darling.
And then the fourth line, which is usually a repetition of the second line, once again with those stress points where the crew would perform a particular pulling or pushing.
All on the bowling, hole.
And that's how it proceeded. And the songs would usually last as long as the job lasted. So the shanty man would have a kind of repertoire of lines and stock phrases, normally which he could kind of fit into whatever the rhythm was. These were about ports, about sailing conditions, about particular ships or shipping lines. So you find the same lines replicated again and again across different shanties.
It's a bit like the blues in that regard, or all of those traditional songs from England and Ireland that start with, as I walked out on a May morning, that they swap lines from song to song.
Absolutely, yeah. There are kind of deeper links with the blues, but certainly in terms of structure and form, it's a kind of pre-literary, much more oral form in which the singers are relying on kind of stock memories that they have inherited from previous singers and previous contexts. And the lines mostly will fit into a particular either a 4/4 structure or some variation on a 3/4 time signature. So you can squeeze the lines in where you want, basically. And sometimes people, I guess, would make up new lines, stuff they'd heard on shore or in port when they were there, or stuff about a particular member of the crew that some kind of bright spark made up. And then that would start to develop a life of its own that would be sung by another person on board another ship. And that would add to the kind of stock of the shanty lexicon of phrases.
I wouldn't mind exploring that connection with the blues, if you don't mind, because I'm interested that you mentioned, the field hollers of the southern United States, the plantations there. And, of course, you also mentioned slavery, and here is a connection with a connection with Liverpool for a start. Are there musical connections, do you think, between shanties and songs of the plantation, or for that matter, songs for chain gangs, which also had that call and response form?
I think there must be, and certain researchers have pointed to certain connections. There's a song I talk about in my book called Clear the Track, Let the Bullgine Run. That seems to have started its life in melodic terms as a kind of fairly old Irish ballad. The melody it's in a kind of minor tonality, and it's got a certain kind of lilt to its melody. And it goes through various metamorphoses. The crews working out of Liverpool and New York and Boston were largely Irish, but the crews themselves were very multi-ethnic and multi-linguistic. So there is a scenario whereby this ballad might have been being sung on some transatlantic ship, perhaps during the famine. There was a large amount of traffic between Ireland and the eastern seaboard of North America to Canada and the United States during the 1840s in particular. A version of that song makes its way into the port of Mobile in Alabama, where, of course, it clashes up. America is going through a big expansion of the railroad during this period as well. The railroad is making its way into all the southern states, and most of those crews were slaves still. So there is a scenario whereby that song goes into Mobile. It's picked up by stevedores, people unloading the ships, and it's passed on to people working on the rail crews, and then it gets turned into a railroad song. The bullgine is an engine, and then it comes back into the port, and it's picked up by the sailors again, and it ends up as a shanty once again on the transatlantic routes. So you can see that kind of thing. That's kind of folkloric mechanism is going on all the time, whereby people are giving things to other populations. They're turning it to their own uses and then giving it back again.
Oh, the smartest packeting you can find, hey-a-ho, you most on, is the old Red Bull of the Black Bull line. Clear away the track and let the bullgine run to me, hey, rig-a-jig in a jaunting car, hey-a-ho, you most on. with the lives of me all on my knee. Clear away the track and let the bull giant run. Oh, the old Red Bull of the Black Bull line. Hey, ho, you monster.
You're listening to The Music Show on Radio National, and my guest is Jerry Smith, who is Professor of Irish Cultural History at Liverpool John Moores University. And the reason we're speaking to him today is that we're talking about sea shanties, and Jerry's also the author of, well, quite a few books actually, but the one that we're concerned with is Sailor Song, the Shanties and Ballads of the High Seas. I'd like to come back to being on board. How do you become a shanty man? I mean, it's a sort of musical foreman, isn't it? Mm. But do you get the job because you're a good foreman, or because you're a good singer, or because you can remember the words?
I think it's probably a combination of all those things. Also, you have to have survived, because lots of sailors, I guess they would have taken to it for a while and then realised that it didn't suit them, or they would have come a cropper in either at sea or in port for one reason or another. So you have to be around long enough. You have to be a decent singer or a good shouter. You have to have a bit of confidence. You have to be reliable, so the officer class will trust you to be able to do the task. But it's not a formal kind of role on board ship. It's not like first mate or second mate or anything else. It's kind of informal, although apparently it did have some benefits attached to it. One of the things that the owners would do, or the officer class would do when they were picking a crew, would be to make sure they had at least one good shantyman on board. The one I'm most familiar with is a guy called Stan Hugel, who you may have heard of, who had links with Australia and spent some time in Australia, but was born and brought up in Hoylake on Wirral, just south of Liverpool, where I live now. So when I found out about this in the first instance, I live very close to the sea, and found out that he was a kind of principal shanty researcher who had been a shantyman himself on board sailing vessels in the early decades of the 20th century. That was a real buzz for me, and he's written a lot about the shantyman and his task, his role on board ship.
You mentioned, Jerry, the way in which these shanties are sometimes composites of other bits of shanties. What about the music? What about the tunes? Because these are not necessarily old songs. They presumably get their tunes from elsewhere. I'm thinking here of maybe one of the most famous shanties of all, What Shall We Do with the Drunken Sailor?
Yes, the music itself, I mean, when it starts off as a form, people have speculated that it must have been not very melodic in itself. It was a call or a shout or a cry. But gradually, I think it begins to take on melodic form when melody itself starts to kind of develop and become a more important part of international culture. And the first melodies, I guess, would have been folk melodies, but also hymns and military tunes and anything that was available, really. And as music culture develops throughout the 19th century, and sailors would have been more exposed to it in ports, in music hall, for example, or in other forms of entertainment, they would have been exposed to more melodic possibilities, which in turn then were incorporated into shanties. What Shall We Do with the Drunken Sailor is based on a very old Irish march from the medieval period, a march called O Roche do Vahawalya, which basically means something like, hurrah, you're coming home again. So that, I suppose, would have been known in Irish culture throughout the 18th, 19th century, and then some bright spark of a sailor at one point would have said this would work well if we did it this way.
Well, what shall we do with the drunken sailor? What shall we do with the drunken sailor? What shall we do with the drunken sailor? Early in the morning, way up she rises, way up she rises, way
We heard earlier Bound for South Australia, and we were talking about the fact that a lot of songs originate in Liverpool from the point of view of the lyrics. That's where they set out from. Quite a lot of the ships were coming to Australia, but Australia actually doesn't feature that much, does it? It doesn't get name-checked in quite the same way as Liverpool and Amsterdam and New York.
No, and I'm surprised about that for the reason that you mentioned, that there is a tremendous amount of traffic, especially Britain and Australia, but also other countries as well. And this may be different in other national shanty traditions, about which I don't know that much. The thing about shanties is I'm talking about the Anglophone tradition by and large, but there are shanty traditions in French and in Swedish and in German and in Russian as well. So I don't really know about those. But in the British tradition, which at this point incorporates Ireland, and in the American tradition, there's not that much. There's a little bit about the South Seas in the American tradition, and there's a little bit about what they would call the flying fish sailors of Asia in the British tradition. But not that much about Australia. There's plenty of ballads, of course, transportation ballads and the like, but not so many shanties. South Australia is obviously the exception, and I first heard it on a Pogues album in the 1980s, done in kind of typical Pogues fashion, very fast and very raucous.
In South Australia I was born.
Came away, haul away.
In South Australia round Cape Horn.
We're bound for South Australia.
Yeah, haul away, you rolling king.
Came away, haul away.
Haul away, you'll hear me sing.
South Australia.
'Cause I woke up morning fire.
Came away, haul away.
'Cause there I met this Nancy Blair.
South Australia.
Haul away, you rolling king.
Came away, haul away.
Haul away, you'll hear me sing.
South Australia.
I don't even know what the connection is with South Australia, really, other than the fact that Australia scans well in that particular line. But it's still very much part of the canon. So whenever you go and see a shanty concert anywhere in the UK or Ireland, South Australia is bound to be rolled out at some point.
What about when shanties are no longer on board, when they become things that are sung in clubs and concert halls, for that matter? Do they change? Do they lose something intrinsic? And I mean, we might here mention the Wellerman phenomenon as well. Not that Wellerman is actually a shanty at all, but that business on TikTok last year, which a lot of our listeners will be aware of, where people were suddenly singing in parts sea songs, that was an interesting phenomenon too, wasn't it?
Soon may the Wellerman come to bring us sugar and tea and rum. One day when the tonguing is done, we'll take our leave and go. She'd not been 2 weeks from shore when down on her a right whale bore. The captain called all hands and swore he'd take that whale in tow. Soon may the Wellerman come to bring us sugar and tea and rum. One day when the tonguing is done, we'll take our leave and go.
There's two issues there. One is the kind of definition, the formal definition of a shanty, which relates to the Wellerman and to TikTok. But your first question was about what happens when you take the shanty out of its kind of its proper environment and reproduce it elsewhere. And like everything else, I mean, there are mixed opinions on it. Some people are very down on it and they think, oh, the shanties must be sung in the way that they were originally composed, and that you kind of adulterate it in some ways when you take it out of its work environment and you bring it into a kind of a performance environment, like a concert hall or even a pub for that matter. Which I really don't agree with. I think, the music doesn't belong to anybody because they were so, from such a diverse background. The songs themselves were composite bits and pieces, both melodically and lyrically. They weren't written down. They weren't authored in that sense, so nobody owned them. So the idea of kind of wanting to preserve them in their original context doesn't really work for me. I'm happy for them to be sung and enjoyed and reinterpreted anywhere and everywhere, as long as it's it's keeping the tradition alive.
Before the boat had hit the water, the whale's tail came up and caught her. Hands to the side, harping and fought her when she dived down low.
And the second question related to the Wellerman and the TikTok tradition, which, it's very fortuitous that my book, which was initially supposed to come out in April last year, was put off for a year by the pandemic, and it was supposed to come out in April this year, and then the TikTok thing broke around Christmas time, and the British Library, with whom I was publishing the book, decided that this was too good a thing to miss out on. So they needed to catch the TikTok wave, and they rush released it towards the end of February. All on the back of the TikTok shanty phenomenon, which then I had to point out to all the people who wanted to interview me about it, is not actually a shanty. And this kind of developed into a little kind of controversy of its own. You know, lots of people were very happy to take that angle and, you know, shock horror. Shanty is not actually a shanty, says Liverpool professor. That kind of rubbish. Where actually what I was saying was that it's sung with reference to some shanty values, the kind of unison chorus, but it wouldn't have worked as a shanty. Ballads were different. Ballads weren't sung as work songs. Would have been sung by the sailors when they were off duty, even if they were on board. They would sing hymns and long ballads, music hall songs, and anything they wanted to. But they weren't shanties. They had a different format. So the Wellerman is a ballad, and it's a very good ballad, and written really, you know, brilliantly performed.
Jerry, thank you very much indeed for being my guest on the music show and talking shanties with us.
You're very welcome.
Help me, boy, bully in the alley. Way, hey, bully in the alley. Help me, boy, bully in the alley. Bully down a Shinbone now. Well, Sally is a girl in Shinbone Alley. Way, hey, bully in the alley. Now, Sally is a girl who I spliced nearly. Bully down a Shinbone now. So, help me, boy, bully in the alley. Way, hey, bully in the alley. Help me, boy, bully in the alley. Bully down a Shinbone now.
We were hearing from Jerry Smith. His book is called Sailor Song, The Shanties and Ballads of the High Seas, and it's published by the British Library. You're listening to The Music Show on RN Summer. Well, now we've had some historical perspective, we'll talk about how the shanty has fared more recently and also what it's actually like to sing these songs. We're going to Albany, Western Australia, to meet Gary Greenwald, who's responsible for starting the Albany International Folk and Shanty Festival. It was due to happen the weekend after this program was first broadcast, but sadly it was postponed due to a Western Australian lockdown. However, the festival did go ahead successfully in October last year. As well as being the man behind the festival, Gary also started the Albany Shantymen, and we're listening to them now.
Both white and red, bully down a Shinbone now. So help me, boy, I'm bully in the alley. Way, hey, bully in the alley. Help me, boy, I'm bully in the alley. Bully down a Shinbone now.
That was the Albany Shantymen, and that was Bully in the Alley. And it's a pleasure to welcome to the music show the leader of the Albany Shantymen, and that is Gary Greenwald. Gary, hello.
How are you doing?
I'm well. Let's set the scene. Tell us about Albany. This was an important maritime city once upon a time. Is it still?
Yes, yeah. It's a big regional port, and there's lots of farming produce and chipped wood and various other products that get exported through the port. Port's a big employer, and the maritime history for Albany has been a big part of shaping the culture of the town.
And was it already an important port in the days of the shanty?
Yes, it would have been huge. And predating it being known as it is now as Albany, it had a whaling history and a seal fishing history, and all of those industries would have had working songs sung as part of that work.
The shanty in Australia, I mean, when you came here from England 5 years ago, and you were surprised that there wasn't more shanty singing going on. I mean, that's why you set up your group.
So the popularity of shanty singing across the world is huge. And to give it some kind of sense of scale, you have shanty festivals in Canada and in the United States and across European nations that attract tens of thousands of people every year. So if you look at shanty festivals like Paimpol in France and Krakow in Poland, they have over 100,000 people attend those festivals annually. And port towns that have maritime history, fishing history, naval history, will have shanty groups. So if you work your way around the county of Norfolk, where I'm from, there would be shanty groups in Sheringham, Cromer, and right the way round until you get to the next county. So the big port towns would have shanty groups. So it was part and parcel of maritime culture in the UK. And many of the shanties that I would sing when I was with a shanty group in the UK were about Australia. So I fully expected coming to Australia, given the huge amount of maritime history that Australia has, given that so much of the population of Australia live around coastal regions, that there would be a culture. There was going to be a culture of singing shanties when I got here.
I wonder whether it's possibly because of the work associated with shanties on the whole vanished. And in a way, it's perhaps more surprising that shanties are still sung as much as they are in England, because, people are not hauling sails or pulling ropes on ships in England, are they? This is a shore-based activity now.
But there was a resurgence. There was a resurgence in folk music in the 1970s. In the 1980s and 90s, you had countries like Poland, who in the post-communist years were looking to re-identify their cultural roots. And in Poland, certainly, the powerful movements like Lech Wałęsa's movement were based around dockyards, and there was a big maritime sort of history for Poland, and so they identified shanty singing as their kind of folk music of choice, and that I think spread across Europe, and there was an interest in the kind of cross-pollination of different cultures, songs. So there are shanty songs and work songs from all over the world. And I think it just, it appealed to people. And because many people musically didn't have the opportunity to learn instruments or learn to sing in childhood, having working songs that are incredibly accessible made it possible for people to have a journey into music later in life that they wouldn't otherwise have had.
Our boots and clothes are all in pawn.
Go down, you blood-red roses, go down.
Well, it's flaming drafty round Cape Horn.
Go down, you blood-red roses, go down.
Come on!
Oh, you pinks and posies. Go down, you blood-red roses, go down.
My dear old mother said to me,
go down, you blood-red roses, go down.
My dearest son, come home from sea.
Go down, you blood-red roses, go down. Oh, you pinks and posies. Go down, you blood-red roses, go down.
And what do you get from it, would you say? Can you just describe the feeling of shanty singing?
Yeah, I think anything that brings together groups of people to a common purpose definitely benefit your mental health. So group singing, there's lots published about how good it is for your mental health. But I think particularly for blokes, trying to get blokes to join choirs is a bit like trying to get blokes up on the dance floor. Australian men, British men, there's a level of discomfort with it. But if you put them in a footy crowd, they'll sing. And if you put them in a pub where people are singing shanties, they'll sing. And then once they kind of cross that line, once you break the inertia and get people involved, they realise the euphoria, the enjoyment, the sense of team camaraderie you get from singing the same songs together. And we have people who accidentally came and saw us. They'd wander into the pub. And at first, you'd see people throwing each other little looks like, oh, God, what are we going to have now? And it's going to spoil our dinner. And by the end of the evening, they're approaching you saying, I've never heard anything like this. How do I get involved? And it's a curious thing. You mentioned that this music had kind of gone away, but group singing hadn't really gone away for our grandparents and their parents. If you look at the people that went through the Second World War, they would meet and sing together. And whether it was singing along with Dame Vera Lynn or something else, people had group songs that they sung as communities. And then I think with the rise in popularity of televisions, and particularly televisions in pubs, that seemed to disappear. And we've had, I'd say, a couple of generations who've lost something, but are refinding it. And if you look at the popularity of shanty singing, particularly among young people, you've only got to look at shanty clubs like Marrickville and Redfern in Sydney. You don't get many greybeards in there. They're all younger people that are doing it. And so it's a curious thing that it kind of crosses age boundaries. You get groups like mine where we're predominantly middle-aged men, but in other groups, it's very much something that's done by young people. But I think it is reconnecting with something that we lost. That's that kind of community you get through group singing. And as I say, it's not just about men, but I think men are difficult to engage in choirs. I think it's opened up opportunities, and we've done workshops for men, for women, for mixed groups. And the biggest hurdle to get over is just joining in. Once they're there, it's easy because they're not hard songs.
The Albany Folk and Shanty Festival's next weekend, and you're bringing together a lot of different sorts of groups, including all women groups. Diversity is everywhere. Is this important to the future of the shanty, do you think?
I think so. And I think the reason that we chose the name Albany International Folk and Shanty Festival is in recognition that if you are looking for a kind of music that crosses all cultural boundaries, working music does that. So the rhythms of mining songs are similar to the rhythms of the Gandhi dancers singing on the railways, are similar to woodworking songs, are similar to the felting songs sung by women in the Hebrides while they were creating cloth, dyeing cloth. The rhythms are the same. And it's curious, if you listen to songs, if you go onto YouTube and you look up The Singing Fishermen of Ghana, a grainy black and white film of these men pulling in nets from the sea, the music's the same. The language is different, but the music's the same. And so I love the fact that all cultures had these working songs that people united around. And it really is very much the kind of history of folk music. It made hard physical tasks easier to sing them while working. So I would love it if one year at the Albany Shanty Festival we had a group of people singing Malay fishing songs. I'd love it if we had a group of guys singing a kind of Arabic building song, because I think that is the future of this, and it is about recognising that these are the songs of your average working people.
Well, I think if you build it, they will come. We'll come and broadcast from your festival if you get our Arabic builders to arrive. That sounds like a fantastic aspiration. And
I don't know if you're aware of this, but we have within our local Menang Noongar community a whaler who worked at the turn of the last century, who was working on tall ships, and he was singing whaling songs, singing maritime folk music in his traditional Noongar language, and that was all recorded. And one of the aspirations that we have is that we work with our local Menang Noongar community and our Kareng Noongar community and introduce that music into the festival as well to celebrate the local Aboriginal history of maritime music.
Well, you've just brought today's music show full circle. Thanks for that, Gary Greenwald. Thanks for talking to me on today's music show.
Thank you very much.
The Albany International Folk and Shanty Festival was postponed in July, as I mentioned. This was when we originally broadcast this programme, but it went ahead successfully in October. And fingers crossed for an even bigger event this year. Who knows, maybe the music show will make an appearance. I've never been to Albany. That's it for today. Do go to our website for details of all of the music that we've managed to stuff into today's show. It was produced by Ellie Parnell and Caitlin Benedict, sound engineers Roy Huberman and Nathan Turnbull, and thank you to the staff at the ABC Music Library for helping us track down all of these sea shanties. Next week, we'll have more great summer programming. We'll hear from the Perth band Altar Boy. That's a band where half the members are deaf or hard of hearing. We'll meet Easter Island's first classical concert pianist, Mahani Teave, the Northern Irish trio True, and the Buryat band Namgar. They're from Mongolia. We'll finish with a pump shanty. We started with one today, Bound for South Australia as a pump shanty. It's one of the last songs that you sing on board, and this one in particular is the final song, just as you're coming into dock after you've pumped out the ship. We hand over to the late, great Danny Spooner singing on RN's Music Deli 10 years ago.
The last job on a ship, once you got into port and they're unloading her and you're getting the gear off her and preparing her for her next, for a refit or whatever, the very last job on the ship was pump her dry. We had to pump her dry. And the very last order that was given, and it was the only time it was given on a ship, was that will do, men. And that meant you could now go. The rats had gone, you could go as well.
All the work was hard and the wages low. Leave her, Johnny, leave her. But now at last ashore we'll go, and it's time for us to leave her. Leave her, Johnny, leave her. Oh, leave her, Johnny, leave her. But now at last ashore we'll go, and it's time for us to leave her. Oh, the mate was a bucko and the skipper was a Turk. Leave her, Johnny, leave her. And the boatswain was a bastard with a middle name of work. And it's time for us to leave her. Leave her, Johnny, leave her. Oh, leave her, Johnny, leave her. Well, the boatswain was a bastard with a middle name of work. And it's time for us to leave her. Cross the Western Ocean in the month of May. Leave her, Johnny, leave her. Cross the Western Ocean's a bloody long way, and it's time for us to leave her. Leave her, Johnny, leave her. Oh, leave her, Johnny, leave her. Cross the Western Ocean is a bloody long way, and it's time for us to leave her. Oh, the wind was foul, the seas ran high. Leave her, Johnny, leave her. She slipped it green and none went by. And it's time for us to leave her. Leave her, Johnny, leave her. Oh, leave her, Johnny, leave her. She slipped it green and none went by. And it's time for us to leave her. Let it pump or drown, the old man said. Leave her, Johnny, leave her. It's pump you alls, or we'll all be dead. And it's time for us to leave